Case closed. JFK killed after shutting down Rothschild's Federal Reserve. On June 4, 1963, a virtually unknown presidential decree, Executive Order 11,110, was signed with the authority to basically strip the Rothschild Bank of its power to loan money to the United States federal government at interest. With the stroke of a pen, President Kennedy declared that the privately owned Rothschild Federal Reserve Bank would soon be out of business. The Christian Law Fellowship has exhaustively researched this matter through the Federal Register and Library of Congress. We can now safely conclude that this executive order has never been repealed, amended, or superseded by any subsequent executive order. In simple terms, it is still valid. When President John Fitzgerald Kennedy signed this order, it returned to the United States federal government, specifically the Treasury Department, the constitutional power to create and issue currency, money, without going through the privately owned Rothschild Federal Reserve Bank. The Federal Reserve, a myth that all Americans live with, is the charade known as the Federal Reserve. It comes as a shock to many to discover that it is not an agency of the United States government. The name Federal Reserve Bank was designed to deceive, and it still does. It is not federal, nor is it owned by the government. It is privately owned. It pays its own postage like any other corporation. Its employees are not in civil service. Its physical property is held under private deeds, and is subject to local taxation. Government property, as you know, is not. It is an engine that has created private wealth that is unimaginable, even to the most financially sophisticated. It has enabled an imperial elite to manipulate our economy for its own agenda and enlisted the government itself as its enforcer. It controls the times, dictates business, affects our homes and practically everything in which we are interested. It takes powerful force to maintain an empire, and this one is no different. The concerns of the leadership of the Federal Reserve and its secretive international benefactors appear to go well beyond currency and interest rates. Executive Order 11,110. President Kennedy's Executive Order 11,110 gave the Treasury Department the explicit authority to issue silver certificates against any silver bullion, silver, or standard silver dollars in the Treasury. This means that for every ounce of silver in the United States Treasury's vault, the government could introduce new money into circulation based on the silver bullion physically held there. As a result, more than $4 billion in United States notes were brought into circulation in $2 and $5 denominations. $10 and $20 United States notes were never circulated but were being printed by the Treasury Department when Kennedy was assassinated. It appears obvious that President Kennedy knew the Federal Reserve notes being used as the purported legal currency were contrary to the Constitution of the United States of America. United States notes were issued as an interest-free and debt-free currency backed by silver reserves in the United States Treasury. We compared a Federal Reserve note issued from the private Central Bank of the United States, the Federal Reserve Bank aka Federal Reserve System, with a United States note from the United States Treasury issued by President Kennedy's executive order. They almost look alike, except one says Federal Reserve Note on the top while the other says United States Note. Also, the Federal Reserve Note has a green seal and serial number while the United States Note has a red seal and serial number. President Kennedy was assassinated on November 22, 1963, and the United States notes he had issued were immediately taken out of circulation. Federal Reserve notes continued to serve as the legal currency of the nation. According to the United States Secret Service, 99% of all the United States paper currency circulating in 1999 are Federal Reserve notes. Kennedy knew that if the silver-backed United States notes were widely circulated, they would have eliminated the demand for Federal Reserve notes. This is a very simple matter of economics. The USN was backed by silver and the FRN was not backed by anything of intrinsic value. Executive Order 11,110 should have prevented the national debt from reaching its current level. Virtually all of the nearly $9 trillion in federal debt has been created since 1963, if LBJ or any subsequent president were to enforce it. It would have almost immediately given the United States government the ability to repay its debt without going to the private Federal Reserve banks and being charged interest to create new money. Executive Order 11,110 gave the USA the ability to, once again, create its own money backed by silver and realm value worth something. Again, according to our own research, just 5 months after Kennedy was assassinated, no more of the Series 1958 silver certificates were issued either, and they were subsequently removed from circulation. Perhaps the assassination of JFK was a warning to all future presidents not to interfere with the private Rothschild Federal Reserve's control over the creation of money. It seems very apparent that President Kennedy challenged the powers that exist behind the United States and world finance. On November 22, 1963, JFK was shot dead in Dallas, Texas, in extremely strange circumstances. Phyllis Hall, a nurse who was part of desperate attempts to save the life of President John F. Kennedy after he was assassinated, has claimed he was shot by a mystery bullet. There is also strong evidence involving Lyndon B. Johnson, the following USA president, in the assassination conspiracy. List of the United States presidents murdered by the Rothschild banking cartel. Lincoln's private war. The Trail of Blood. Abraham Lincoln worked valiantly to prevent the Rothschilds' attempts to involve themselves in financing the Civil War. Interestingly, it was the Tsar of Russia who provided the needed assistance against the British and French, who were among the driving forces behind the secession of the South and her subsequent financing. Russia intervened by providing naval forces for the Union blockade of the South in European waters, and by letting both countries know that if they attempted to join the Confederacy with military forces, they would also have to go to war with Russia. The Rothschild interests did succeed, through their agent Treasury Secretary Salmon P. Chase, to force a bill, the National Banking Act, through Congress creating a federally chartered central bank that had the power to issue the United States banknotes. Afterward, Lincoln warned the American people, the money power preys upon the nation in time of peace and conspires against it in times of adversity. It is more despotic than monarchy, more insolent than autocracy, more selfish than bureaucracy. I see in the near future a crisis approaching that unnerves me, and causes me to tremble for the safety of our country. Corporations have been enthroned, an era of corruption will follow, and the money power of the country will endeavor to prolong its reign by working upon the prejudices of the people, until the wealth is aggregated in a few hands, and the republic is destroyed. Lincoln continued to fight against the central bank, and some now believe that it was his anticipated success in influencing Congress to limit the life of the Bank of the United States to just the war years that was the motivating factor behind his assassination. The lone assassin myth is born. Modern researchers have uncovered evidence of a massive conspiracy that links the following parties to the Bank of Rothschild: Lincoln's Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, John Wilkes Booth, his 8 co-conspirators, and over 70 government officials and businessmen involved in the conspiracy. When Booth's diary was recovered by Stanton's troops, it was delivered to Stanton. When it was later produced during the investigation, 18 pages had been ripped out. These pages, containing the aforementioned names, were later found in the attic of one of Stanton's descendants. From Booth's trunk, a coded message was found that linked him directly to Judah P. Benjamin, the Civil War campaign manager in the South for the House of Rothschild. When the war ended, the key to the code was found in Benjamin's possession. The assassin, portrayed as a crazed lone gunman with a few radical friends, escaped by way of the only bridge in Washington not guarded by Stanton's troops. Booth was located hiding in a barn near Port Royal, Virginia, 3 days after escaping from Washington. He was shot by a soldier named Boston Corbett, who fired without orders. Whether or not the man killed was Booth is still a matter of contention, but the fact remains that whoever it was, he had no chance to identify himself. It was Secretary of War Edwin Stanton who made the final identification. Some now believe that a dupe was used and that the real John Wilkes Booth escaped with Stanton's assistance. Mary Todd Lincoln, upon hearing of her husband's death, began screaming, "Oh, that dreadful house! Earlier historians felt that this spontaneous utterance referred to the White House. Some now believe it may have been directed to Thomas W. House, a gun runner, financier, and agent of the Rothschilds during the Civil War, who was linked to the anti-Lincoln, pro-banker interests. Andrew Jackson was the first president from west of the Appalachians. He was unique for the times in being elected by the voters, without the direct support of a recognized political organization. He vetoed the renewal of the charter for the Bank of the United States on July 10, 1832. In 1835, President Andrew Jackson declared his disdain for the international bankers. "You are a den of vipers. I intend to rout you out, and by the eternal God I will rout you out." If the people only understood the rank injustice of our money and banking system, there would be a revolution before morning. There followed an unsuccessful assassination attempt on President Jackson's life. Jackson had told his vice president, Martin Van Buren, "The bank, Mr. Van Buren, is trying to kill me." Was this the beginning of a pattern of intrigue that would plague the White House itself over the coming decades? Was his, and Lincoln's, death related by an invisible thread to the international bankers? James Garfield, President James Abram Garfield, our 20th president, had previously been chairman of the House Committee on Appropriations and was an expert on fiscal matters. Upon his election, among other things, he appointed an unpopular collector of customs at New York, whereupon the two senators from New York, Roscoe Conkling and Thomas Platt, resigned their seats. President Garfield openly declared that whoever controls the supply of currency would control the business and activities of all the people. After only 4 months in office, President Garfield was shot at a railroad station on July 2, 1881. Another coincidence. The trail of blood continues. In the 70s and 80s, Congressman Larry P. McDonald spearheaded efforts to expose the hidden holdings and intentions of the international money interests. His efforts ended on August 31, 1983, when he was killed when Korean Airlines 007 was accidentally shot down in Soviet airspace. A strange coincidence, it would seem. Senator John Hines and former Senator John Tower had served on powerful Senate banking and finance committees and were outspoken critics of the Federal Reserve and the Eastern establishment. On April 4, 1991, Senator John Hines was killed in a plane crash near Philadelphia. On the next day, April 5, 1991, former Senator John Tower was also killed in a plane crash. The coincidences seem to mount. Attempts to just audit the Federal Reserve continue to meet with failure. It is virtually impossible to muster support for any issue that has the benefit of a media blackout. The bizarre but tragic reality that the American people suffer from a managed and controlled media is a subject for another discussion. Beginning of a series. For many years, numerous authors have attempted to sound the alarm that there exists a hidden shadow government that actually rules America. Most of us had dismissed these conspiracy theory views as extremist and unrealistic. However, when I had the opportunity to have lunch with Otto von Habsburg, member of the European Parliament, he made 2 remarks that caught my attention. The first was, "The ignorance in America is overwhelming." Indeed, the contrast in general awareness of world affairs between the average American and the average European is striking. It was his second observation that really provoked me. The concentration of power in America is frightening. As a reasonably circumspect senior executive, having spent 3 decades in international finance and viewing America as a broadly based representative democracy, his remark shocked me. It prompted me to do some more homework. The results of my inquiries are most disturbing.